So hello everybody, and welcome to this exciting what we call IIPP conversations. So it's hopefully first of many to follow. The next talk I can plug already is in, I think it's 14th November. Is that in 3 weeks? And then it's about pluralism in economics. So show up for this one as well, and then there will be few more to follow. So my name is Kattel. I'm a professor here at IIPP and also a deputy director. And you might wonder why I'm speaking to the microphone and there is no elevation of my voice, but this is for the audiences online. So hello, welcome everybody online. So if you want to turn around and say hello to the camera, you may want to do that. And so we will try to not forget people online. So if you have comments or questions, please post them. And yes, there are people in the room who will actually follow the chat. So you will not be forgotten. Yeah, so this is IIPP Conversations. And what we try to do is we are trying to converse around emerging and new research. And today we have a very interesting and very exciting book to discuss, which talks about bureaucracy. And of course you may wonder, or maybe not, you're not anymore wondering probably, why we are talking about bureaucracy at an Institute for Urban Innovation and Public Purpose. You might wonder that, innovation and bureaucracy aren't they juxtaposing ideas, but as we will see hopefully today as well, actually not. A lot of the good that is done in public sector needs and creative and innovative bureaucracy. So we'll talk about that. How do we get that particularly in a development context? And so the book we're discussing today is about how bureaucracy can help the least advantaged people in the world in many ways. And yeah, so we have a pleasure of welcoming Akshay Mangla here at IIPP. Welcome, Akshay. And Akshay works these days at the business school, so it's another interesting juxtaposition, as it were, bureaucracy and business school. But again, this is your career so far. You have been working in business schools mainly, I think. And what we're discussing, the book is has grown out of your PhD work at MIT and become a really, really interesting and nice book. And so we will have initially around 40 minutes of presentation about the book. So but still you're encouraged to go and buy it and read it. So although you get a really deep download of the book. And then we have our own Kate Roll. Probably doesn't need an introduction here, at least in the room, maybe audiences online. So Kate is associate professor with us and also head of teaching and has done a wonderful job in building up our MPA, Master in Public Administration or Master in Bureaucracy, you might call it. So it's a very proper person, as it were, to discuss this. And her work has been focusing on development, state building, statehood, and also systems underlying policies and implementation. So yes, so Kate will be the initial discussant, and after that we'll open up the floor, obviously. And after 1.5 hours, there is some reception outside of this room, so you can have a conversation with the author of the book, with Kate, anybody else you might want to have a discussion. So this is pretty much from me. Are there any questions already? Good. So Akshay, floor is yours.
Great. And thank you for the introduction. I should use this.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Well, I was told to stand, so I don't normally stand in rooms where we're this close to each other. So please don't blame me for that. Right, so I appreciate this invitation. I've been following the work at this institute and learned a lot from it, and I really appreciate being in the room with all of you and thinking through a set of questions that have occupied my time for, gosh, more than the last 10, 12 years. And in the introduction, I noted the fact that I'm at a business school, and part of what we're trying to do is get a shift in thinking about what an MBA is. It could also include understanding the state, institutions, the political relationships in which business and non-governmental actors find themselves situated. And in that sense, you can think of bureaucracy as one of the fundamentals that shapes how business interfaces with its local governance structures. So the topic of the talk is my book, Making Bureaucracy Work, norms, education, and public service delivery in rural India. And I'm going to try to develop the link between these three things: norms, education, and public service delivery. And I think the running thread is to think about how it is that an official even understands what's required of him or her when given a policy mandate. And then you can already see that there's probably some requirement that they're trained in a set of norms and enculturated in a set of practices, which then may shape how education is actually delivered on the ground. So the kind of motivating question of this book is this big one at the top here: what makes bureaucracy work, particularly for the least advantaged? I think when we step back and look at some of our theories of bureaucracy, there isn't a tendency to actually situate bureaucracy's performance vis-a-vis the particular social groups. And I think this is quite important because bureaucracy may be effective in some things and less so in others. And those who are the least advantaged may lack the voice, may lack the resources, may lack the organizing capabilities to make the same demands as political elites. And so in that regard, one has to think, what are the features of bureaucracy that can serve that, what you could say is the bottom of the pyramid in terms of social hierarchies and income and so on. And I operationalize this question in the domain of India's education for all programming. And the puzzle that emerges here is that India has had over the last, you could say, almost 20 years now, a big spurt of national level programs on universal primary schooling. And these policies, while being nearly identical across Indian states, and Indian states, by the way, India is a federal system, so when I'm talking about states, I'm talking about provincial, kind of provincial governments that have overwhelming authority over implementation. And notwithstanding having the same formal institutions, administrative structures, incentives, you see very different levels of implementation and quality. So what is driving this variation? And that is the core puzzle of the book. So I'll say a bit more about the theory or the background of the theory of the book, what's motivating the search for answers to this, right? Then I'll turn to the empirical context. What is the place where I'm conducting the research? What is the design of the study that allows me to draw some conclusions and make some inferences about, about bureaucracy? I'll present my theory about norms, and I know there's some questions in the audience about what are norms, how do we study them, so hopefully you'll get a little bit of an answer from there. And I'll share some preliminary findings from Northern India, not the entire book. The book goes through several different, you could say, sites of implementation comparatively across Indian states, and then even expands beyond India in terms of trying to think about the theory's scope, outside of this part of Northern India where I did research. But I'll focus on these two major states with the idea that hopefully this can provoke a discussion. And then I'll conclude with some implications, both for our theory of understanding bureaucracy, but also for public policy. I believe this being a policy audience, you might care. What are the conclusions from this exercise? So let me start with some motivation. And actually, before I even begin, just by a show of hands, how many people like bureaucracy? Like? Yeah. Okay, so this is definitely a very different audience from what from what I'm used to. And I asked this question in many different places: political science departments, public policy schools, business schools. And overwhelmingly, there's like one or two hands that are courageous, but I'm glad, I guess you're leading the way in thinking about bureaucracy as more than just a problem. Often when I ask the question, the thing people raise is ideas like red tape, interference, getting in the way of things, a lack of innovation, slowness. I mean, these are the kinds of adjectives that get associated with it. Actually, when you think about it, how critical bureaucracy is to our everyday lives, certainly there's got to be variations in it. And so the starting point is to think about how do we theorize that variation. And I draw on literature on state capacity. There's a quite a robust literature now that identifies the capacity of states to implement public policies, and that state capacity is a key driver of various outcomes of interest, whether it's economic growth, industrial policy development, human development, and so on. And the cross-national studies that I'm focusing on really look at social development, human development indicators like education and health, and state capacities seem to be a key input into achieving results on things like literacy, infant mortality, longevity, and so on. There's another literature that I speak to in the book, which is in the comparative politics of education. And this is trying to understand why are countries so different or similar in the way they organize education and their ability to achieve human capital development. And here the focus has been largely on cross-national differences with an emphasis on spending and an emphasis on policy design. And where I'm trying to move the discussion forward is to shift our gaze towards implementation. And that the kind of high politics of policy making is just the beginning for many people in the world, particularly the least advantaged. For those who are the least advantaged, politics is actually on the streets, on the front line, in a school, at an employment counter, at a public health center. And so for me, policy making is just the start of politics, not the end of politics. And the challenge of implementation in India is quite stark, in that there's all kinds of public policies that are emerging out of India, and yet the link between policy making and design and frontline implementation is often broken, and this is often seen as a gap. And this is a picture it's depicting the myth of Sisyphus, the idea that you keep pushing a rock up, so the policymaker keeps pushing the rock up only for it to come down because of weak implementation. And actually, one social scientist refers to India as a Sisyphean state, a state that's stuck in this cycle of making policies again and again, yet unable to carry them out in implementation. And a lot of the answer for why this is the case begins with thinking about the elite bureaucracy in India, and that's where a lot of the research has been in the Indian administrative services. These are the kind of elite civil servants who take a national exam, very difficult. If you don't succeed at that exam, you end up teaching at Oxford or something like that. And so, the thing to keep in mind is that this is like your paradigm meritocratic, almost semi-Weberian bureaucracy, because they're hired by merit, they're promoted, they have civil service protections, and so on. And yet the problem seems to lie below them, which is the local administration. And just a quick question, does anyone know how many IAS officers there are in India? Anyone want to give like a ballpark estimate? A country of about 1.4 billion. How many? 3,000, that's not too far. It's about 5,000. Yeah, you're quite close. And just to put it in comparative perspective, India overtook China in population. And China has about the equivalent of 500,000 officers. So just to give you a sense of the paucity of state capacity at the elite level, right? And they're overseeing a frontline workforce of about 18 million public employees. And so the gap between the two is already significant just by the sheer numbers. But also the lower levels aren't as, you could say, Weberian in the sense they were not hired necessarily through meritocratic processes. Often they're patronage hires. They may not have the same human capital, and so on. And the challenge is that a lot of these lower quality services at the local level has spurred privatization in India as well. So education and health even more than education. But this has this knock-on effect where those who could exercise voice have exited. And so the political system is not getting the pressure to make the reforms needed. And this is really core to the problem of implementation. So what I try to do in the book in terms of theory is, one, shifting our gaze from the high politics of policy making, but also the elite agencies. So a lot of the work that's been done on bureaucracy in developing countries has built off of this model known as the developmental state. And this is a literature that identified these very high-powered and effective state bureaucracies, particularly in East Asia. In fact, the first is Japan. Japan was the archetypal, state that was capable of organizing industrial policy in a way that facilitated rapid growth. East Asian tigers like Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, thereafter developed a model of a similar type. Now, the challenge with what I'm looking at, which is primary education, is that it's not about elite agencies, but it's about the links between the elite agency and the frontline worker. And there we have to think about the street-level bureaucracies, as per Lipsky and others. These are the people who have a lot of discretion, that once you give them a policy, they can choose. So just to give an example, if I'm a police officer, I can choose whether or not to pull someone over on the street, and that is the kind of discretion that's there in a frontline agent. And the same would go for, say, the provision of education. I can choose how I teach a class, right? So a teacher cannot just be dictated how to teach. This is the way you should teach. Actually, teachers will adapt their teaching based on a number of different factors. Now, the challenge with focusing on this area or this arena of the bureaucracy is that the literature, at least from developing countries, suggests that clientelism, which is the exchange of money for votes, effectively undermines the capacity of street-level bureaucrats. They can be bought out, right? You can buy out a cop. You can bribe, right? So school teachers in India routinely are found to charge for examinations, for instance, right? And so the puzzle is this, that when and why and how do social services reach the least advantaged in these non-variant types of settings? With me so far? Okay. All right, now I'm going to turn to the context a little bit, the site of implementation. And I guess the starting point, and I'm not quite sure why this is uncentered, but perhaps somewhere when I converted it to PDF. Let's just focus on this side. So, some of the indicators for weak implementation in India, I mean, it starts with low low attendance rates of teachers themselves. 25% of teachers are found to be absent on any given day, according to the World Bank. There's really still very high rates of illiteracy and high rates of dropout among children. And this is the work that economists have shown over the years in studying India's social programming. Now, the thing to note is that this is not owing to a lack of public policy. So these are the policies that have emerged since the early 2000s, even before the 2000s, in education. And I just want to flag that India is not kind of a country that does not have political will at the top for education, at least since the mid-90s. So the midday meal program is the largest school lunch program in the world, a free lunch provided every day in every government primary school. Right? And this has been a massive transfer of public funds to improve nutrition and student attendance in school. India has a Right to Education Act that puts a legal duty on the state to provide free and compulsory education. And then India's Education for All program that came out in the 2000s, I've written a separate paper on this, just about the emergence of this policy by innovative bureaucrats, actually, working in tandem with World Bank officials in designing this program. And this program is now everywhere in the country. It provides infrastructure, incentives for students to enroll in school. So you get a scholarship conditional on enrollment, free textbooks, backpacks, uniforms for girls and underprivileged castes. And then this decentralized structure, which is also important. This is not just control from New Delhi. This is actually state and then district and local level actors coming together through a structure that gives them authority over planning at the local level. And we see some results in terms of enrollment. So India now has crossed the 95% enrollment threshold, which is seen as a critical barrier to cross. 200 million children are in the school system. And yet, there's much to be desired inside schools. So this is a school in the state of Uttar Pradesh, India's largest state, about roughly 250 million people, so it could be the 7th largest country by itself. And in this classroom, you see that, there's a paucity of resources. There's no place to sit, really. There's a blackboard that you could see is pretty difficult to read. Though there was effort, even in this school, by the teacher. You'll see this is teaching and learning materials that were painted on the wall. And this was an attempt by this teacher under resource constraints to make the school a little bit better than it would have otherwise been, yet certainly not quite what one would want. Now, this example from the school just gives you an idea that notwithstanding all of this, the translation into the classroom might be missing. The other part I want to emphasize, and this is where the book takes off empirically, is that there's huge subnational variation across India on indicators of implementation. And this is just one indicator. This is student attendance. So this is not enrollment. This is whether or not you've actually attended school in the last week, which is a harder measure of implementation because you can be enrolled and just never come. This is asking kids if you attended the last week. And you see quite a bit of variation. A lot of the variation is between North and South India, and that's where much of the prior research to this book has focused on. You may be familiar with this case of Kerala. It's considered the kind of example of social development, at least from India, and considered an exemplar in the global South for achieving levels of literacy, infant mortality that rival middle-income countries. Now, if you look just between North and South India, you can see stark differences, but so too can you within North India. And part of what I'm trying to push in the book is a more careful attention to research design, because there's a lot of historical differences between the North and the South that could account for some of these large sweeping variations. For instance, being a coastal state, you're more exposed to world trade. I mean, it just makes it easier than if you're a landlocked state. Or in the case of Kerala, there's a history of Portuguese colonization that also brought Christianity. And so Kerala is one of the few states in India that has a very large Christian population. So Christian, Muslim, and Hindu are actually almost in equal thirds. And so those religious dynamics play a role in education. Then there's a history of class and caste-based movement. So I could keep going on. So what I tried to do was select states that were contiguous in the north, in the Hindi-speaking belt, which is considered backwards. So literally, these states are referred to as Bimaru, which means sick in Hindi. So within this region, why are some states better than others? And what I do is a series of multi-level comparisons. So in the book, I look at 2 states, and these are in the Himalayan region, and 2 states that are in the Gangetic Plains. And this is set up in a way that allows me to look very carefully at factors that are similar, yet outcomes that are different. So these 2 states, Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand, have a history. Well, they're both hilly states, similar geography, similar income levels, similar caste composition, similar history of women's participation. And this is very critical because local gender norms matter quite a lot for girls' education. And so I try to control for these things. In the plains, I look at 2 states of UP and Bihar, which are considered the exemplars of clientelism in India. They're considered the states that are the most backward in many regards with respect to public services. And yet, even here, I find some interesting variations. So that's case selection at the state level. I do something similar at the district and the village level. So this is all about the levels of implementation. And as you'll see, I kind of go from national to subnational down to local. And I try to trace the policy implementation process from a state capital down to a village school. So at each level, I try to understand how is it that officials make sense of what their obligations are? How do they relate to those above and below them in the chain of implementation? And I did this through a whole lot of qualitative research. So more than 850 interviews of actors inside the state, outside the state, at different levels of the state. So you'll see here, we have central bureaucrats, state and local bureaucrats, state, these elected officials from the state assembly, all the way down to non-state actors, so teachers' unions, village residents, and a group like this. So this is a women's association in a village that was monitoring the midday meal that was provided in that school. And with these groups, I also conducted focus group discussions, about 100 of them. And this provided an alternative source of data. The things one might tell me one-to-one is very different from what they might say amongst each other, as they're discussing, in a room together. So these are just some of the methods I used, or 2 of the key methods. I also did participant observation inside the bureaucracy, and I can talk a bit about that as I share my findings. Now, I just want to get to the theory, and I think the first step of theorizing how it is that policies get implemented is to be clear on what we mean by implementation, actually. And here I draw on a series of literatures, but I think the piece that I want to emphasize is co-production, and this comes out of the work by Elinor Ostrom, and that when you think about it, education is not delivered, but it's co-produced, at the very least, by children. Children have to sit in the classroom, they have to participate in the class, they have to take in what the teacher says, and so their very presence is co-producing education, right? So it's not just the state delivering it. Then you think about all the inputs that the state provides. Someone has to participate in ensuring that they actually get implemented. So going back 2 slides, this women's association was part of the process of monitoring this midday meal, and so that also points to the community's role in implementation. And I guess the last point, and I'll get to task complexity, so ignore this piece, but this last piece is that when we talk about co-production, a lot of the prior work has kind of identified it almost as a technical relationship, that there's an input from here and an input from there, you find complements, and lo and behold, a good service. What it misses out is that these relations are often power relations that have hierarchies. And if you're the least advantaged, why would you want to participate? Maybe you're going to be mistreated. Maybe you will be disrespected in the process. Maybe your voice won't be heard. Particularly in this case, this is a group of Dalit women. So they're not just women, they're coming from the lowest of the caste hierarchy in Uttar Pradesh. And they're considered, while not legally, because untouchability is illegal, for all intents and purposes in the village, were considered untouchable. So the fact that they're cooking a midday meal that then other children in that village are eating is actually critical. And so there's a lot of conflict in the process of co-producing that food as well. So this is to point out that we need to unpack this implementation into these different components. And what I do in the book is operationalize it on a scale of complexity. You have some tasks that are not as complex, and as you go down this, you'll see tasks that are increasingly complex, those that require more actors to be participating, that require more coordination across state and non-state agencies, and will require thick, repeated exchanges of information and support. So the most basic is enrollment. I think that's perhaps the least complex task, because you just literally have to enroll someone's name in the register, then they're enrolled, right? That is less complex than, say, planning an academic calendar or providing teacher training. These are more intensive, require human resources to be assembled together, and transmission of knowledge and support. To the most complex tasks, things like, well, teaching in a classroom and monitoring a class. This requires repeated coordination between students, teachers, parents, and school administrators. So this is the first point, that we can divide up tasks, right, into their levels of complexity. So when we say something's implemented or not, we can ask, well, what specific task are we talking about? When I say education is implemented, you can imagine I get these things up here, but not these things down here. And let me just show you some indicators I use in the book. So this is the indicators for the least complex tasks. So just taking enrollment indicators across the states I looked at, those that receive a school grant, those that are serving a midday meal in the school. And you see some variation, though it's not quite as stark. If I go further down, and I'll just go to this last one, this is learning indicators. And this, you could say, is the most complex task that a school engages in, is teaching. Right, and here you see very stark differences across the schools. You could see that the schools aren't, even in the best performing state that I'll talk about, Himachal Pradesh, is not doing great, but you see quite dramatic differences. So this is the share of students I can read in fifth grade, and it goes from something like 50% down to 25%. That's a stark difference for just this one region of India. So that just points to the fact that the more complex a task gets, the more differences you see in capacity of agencies to implement that or carry out that particular task. Getting to the theory now. And this is where I'm trying to move beyond thinking about just the standard structures, formal structures, incentives, and resources, but looking at the informal, unwritten rules of the game. So I draw on James Q. Wilson and other bureaucracy scholars who've taught us that bureaucracy isn't the same thing everywhere. The organizational culture of bureaucracy really matters. And it matters in a few ways. One is it can shape the use of discretion. So going back to the example I began with, if I'm a police officer deciding to pull someone over or not, the culture of the agency I work for may help inform and dictate how I exercise that discretion. If the agency I work for has norms that encourage going after a particular community, I might do that. If the agency has norms that encourage fair treatment, that might change how I operate, right? And if there's pressures to do things on the job, that might also influence how I'm thinking. So in some ways, norms are feeding directly into discretion, and this is where I get to this kind of bureaucratic action right here. How do bureaucrats even understand their policy mandates, right? And this is all learned over time. But the other avenue is societal feedback, which is that as I behave in a certain way towards the public develops expectations about me and will alter its behavior. So going back to my example, if I'm a police officer and I'm pulling people over, those people will have a reaction to me in the future. They may decide they don't want to cooperate with the police, or they may decide, if they feel they're treated fairly, that they will help the police when the police seek their support. And so it's important to recognize that for implementation to happen, norms will be shaping how the bureaucrat behaves, but the bureaucrat's actions will be shaping how society behaves. And if we go back to the starting point that I had about implementation being co-production, right? We'll need both of these, both bureaucratic mechanisms and societal mechanisms, to get implementation to actually happen. Now, I theorized two distinct forms of bureaucracy. Before I kind of get into the nitty-gritty of these two, I just want to highlight that while I identify two ideal types in the book, I don't want to suggest that these are the only ideal types, nor do I want to suggest that they're just a simple binary, that you just get the right bureaucracy or you get the wrong bureaucracy. You could actually imagine these sitting along a continuum, and I'll kind of walk you through this. So I draw on really classic literature in bureaucracy and public law to identify what I think is familiar to us, which is a legalistic bureaucracy. This is a bureaucracy whose normative orientation is rules and being rule-bound. So I respond to the rules. If I'm an official, I look to the rules for guidance, and I try to stick as close to the rules as I can. And the dynamics in the organization, communication, and other elements of organizational behavior is shaped by these norms. So if I'm in a legalistic bureaucracy, I'll tend to want to protect administrative hierarchy. I'll tend to want to use formal procedures. I'll tend to want to use written reports as a way of communication, right? And I'll want to rely on official knowledge. And so what kind of evidence I bring in to the table to make a decision has to be seen as official. And if I'm in a deliberative bureaucracy, and here I identify a different kind of normative ideal type, and I draw on literature that's based in political philosophy, on public deliberation and deliberative democracy, pragmatism. And this literature points to a different orientation, which is problem-based, not rule-based. Problem-based means I look at how I can practically solve problems through my work. And officials learn to participate across boundaries and modify rules. Rather than sticking firmly to rules, how can I bend rules in productive ways to solve practical needs? And to do that, I may need both my official knowledge, but also local level knowledge. And so there's a bubbling up of information coming from the frontline agent, but importantly also coming from society upward. And what I argue is that what you find in the first case, the first type of bureaucracy, is a process of implementation that's highly uneven. You get codified tasks, those that are less complex, well implemented, but those that are more complex are either under-implemented or poorly implemented, right? And the reason being that A, you can codify the things and you can operate through rules to achieve them. But secondly, citizens, when they face the state, may face administrative barriers of having to work through rules to get things done. A very different process unfolds in a deliberative bureaucracy, and I'll share some evidence on both of these in a minute. But what I call this second process is adaptive implementation, where you get a policy and you respond to local needs and you adapt it to the situation at the local level. And I argue that this latter process is more effective at delivering things like education. Now, before I share some empirics, let me just point out that you may have the question, where do these different sets of norms come from in the first place? How do you get norms? And in the book, I kind of go through the political history of each of the states, and I think it is a subject of understanding historical formation of an agency, because norms take time to build, and so critical moments become important. So I look at the subnational state formation process, and in particular, the relationship between politicians and bureaucratic elites. And for those of you who may have questions on this, I'm happy to answer in the Q&A, but I'll just simplify this by saying that where you tend to have cooperation between politicians and bureaucrats over the purpose of the state, you tend to get more deliberation, which percolates down. Where you have conflict between the two, bureaucrats tend to use the rules to protect their turf. And that's in a nutshell what I find in the subnational states I look at. So let me share some findings, and I'm going to focus on two states, Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand. These are the two hilly states I'd mentioned when I shared the map with you. And they're interesting because they kind of began at similar starting points. In fact, Uttarakhand had a higher literacy rate at the time of independence, but then there was a switch that took place, and Himachal Pradesh overtook really most of the country, apart from Kerala. It's now the second highest literacy state, though unlike Kerala, it began at about 5% literacy. Kerala was already at 40% literacy, well ahead of the Indian average. And so I think this is a really important story because we need to understand not how places that already have a big head start continue to maintain their head start, though that's an important thing to know. We also need to know how places that begin at a much lower baseline can move up. And I think Himachal Pradesh offers an interesting story about that. So I mentioned the weak initial conditions. The interesting thing about Himachal Pradesh is that community involvement in primary schooling has also been fairly robust in comparison to other areas. Now, how does implementation happen here? So this is a school in Himachal Pradesh. and you can perhaps gain a sense of the challenge. If you're a bureaucrat stationed at the very end of those hills, it's very difficult to monitor what's happening in that school, right? So in some sense, there's a challenge of resources, but also geography. And there's a literature on geography being an impediment to the development of state capacity. Landlocked areas that are mountainous in particular are harder to govern, as the theory goes. Himachal Pradesh provides an alternative for how geography can intersect with norms. So what I observed in Himachal Pradesh were three different levels of solution to addressing this problem of geography. One was the bureaucracy encouraged informal participatory meetings. This is what they referred to these meetings as, participatory. And civil society groups were part of these. So were elected officials. And what they tried to do was have regional inputs into thinking about how a policy can respond to different regions' needs. Different regions have different levels of elevation, different problems in providing school there. So these informal meetings at least gave them an idea, the officials an idea of the nature of the problem of implementing a school in this type of setting. Now, how did they actually translate this knowledge into a practical solution? And I give an example in the book about the district academic calendar. So in India, there's a standard academic calendar where kids take an exam in April, May, which will then set up whether or not they can move on to the next level of schooling. So going from primary to upper primary or upper primary to secondary school. Now, what happens in Himachal Pradesh and perhaps in other parts of India was that actually the timing of these exams coincide with the spring harvest season. So that's the season when kids are often outside helping their parents with agriculture, with collecting the harvest. And if you go to a school then, as I did, you'll find that they're empty. Kids aren't actually in school. So basically, the calendar is setting up the poorest children to fail the exam because that's when they're the most intensively working. What Himachal Pradesh did was start experimenting and give school districts the opportunity to adjust the timing of their examinations. And this small shift in the flexibility of the exam timing allowed way more children to take the exam, but more importantly, succeed at the exam. So they could have the exam at a time when kids were not burdened with work. And as a consequence, a far greater percentage of children in the system here were transitioning from primary to upper primary and thereafter. Another solution, which is even more local, is trying to find ways to target particular communities that are outside of the school system. So the example I open up the book with is this bureaucrat who came up with this program for mobile schooling. So the Gujjar are a tribe, and they primarily move around between the hills and the plains. So in the summertime, they come up to the hills. In the winter, they go down to the plains. Very difficult to educate children if they're moving. So what the bureaucrats did in this district is actually find a way for a school to join them when the kids are moving up and down. So they hired teachers from within the Gujjar community, trained them first as volunteers, but gradually gave them civil service protections and made them teachers. And this mobile school was the first, you could say, effort that succeeded in graduating a cohort of Gujjar children. And it got adopted by other states as well in India. Now, the thing to note, all of this might sound very nice, but it's also full of political conflict. You're telling your regular teachers that were hired through normal civil service protections that you're creating a separate cohort of teachers hired as volunteers and then graduated up. You could imagine the backlash. So the way that officials managed it, and this is where deliberation also comes in, was they identified where were the places where teachers had the less, you could say, like the least resistance, and started in those districts, found ways to gain teacher support, and then gradually rolled it out. So even in the process of rolling out a reform, there was an effort to deliberate with frontline workers who were opposed to it. This is just a quote from an official talking about how norms shape the way he thinks. And there's quotes like this throughout the book, but I thought I'll just highlight one. And he says that when I started my job in 1986, poor ladies and chaps wouldn't come to my office for help. There was a hesitation to work with the state. But over time, we learned that if you deprive Dalits, women, or any weaker section of society access to basic rights, then you cannot achieve overall development. And he's learned this by watching the example of his seniors. And this was critical, that the way my seniors behave, that shapes how I do things. And those who I worked under encouraged me to keep in close touch with my subordinates, keep my doors open to people. So I think that's a major sign of good governance. Completely unprompted, he used terms like good governance. And what good governance means, if you look at the World Bank indicators, definitely not keeping your door open. That's not one of them. But ironically, this official is able to articulate quite an advanced theory of good governance. Now, getting to the most challenging tasks, which is student learning in a school. This is a primary school in Himachal Pradesh. And it was not a place where I expected education to work. It's actually in a far-flung region of the state. It's overwhelmingly comprised of underprivileged castes, interior, and really not where you would expect education to be well delivered or any monitoring to be taking place. And yet I was surprised to find a well-functioning school, and parental satisfaction was much higher than even in neighboring villages where you had more resources. And the midday meal was provided in all of this. So I was quite impressed by this case. And I wanted to understand why and how the school got to be this way. And over a period of fieldwork, and I spent about a good month and a half living nearby this village. And this is a group of women who belong to a women's association. And this part of India has a history of these groups known as Mahila Mandals. They're women's groups that have emerged around other local needs, collective agriculture, managing local natural resources like forests and water and so on. Now, the key thing about this group is that they also identified a challenge with the school and wanted to get involved. And so when they initially started voicing their interest in managing things at the school, the local state identified that this is an opportunity for us to pilot a governance structure. So what they developed in Himachal Pradesh, unlike in other states in India, where they have parent-teacher associations, is that they created a mother-teacher association. And this is quite relevant because in many states, men are either are no longer working in agriculture or moving outside. This happens to be a state with a high remittance economy where men are out working in urban areas, sending money back. So women are in the public sphere, yet they are not empowered to have as much say in everyday governance. Just to give an example, when you enroll in a government school in India, quite often they'll ask for your name and ask for your father's name, and that will be on your card. Now, if you're the mother and you want to demand something from the school, you face this uphill battle of fighting a patriarchal system that's encoded in public administration. So this state broke with that. They identified that we can try a pilot where we'll create mother-teacher associations, grant women the authority to govern the school campus, work with the school teacher, and over the course of doing these training sessions, public officials came to understand community concerns better and vice versa. So this is just a quote from an official that in the course of expanding the school system throughout the state, we found women contribute more to the primary schools. And what I'm not sharing, by the way, is a whole lot of interview data showing how awful things were in the school many years before this association came about. So the steps that had to be taken were quite significant. So I'll share some comparative findings and then I'll wrap up. So in Uttarakhand, I see the persistence of a legalistic bureaucracy. And this is an interesting state to look at because actually, the state of Uttarakhand came out of the state of Uttar Pradesh. So Uttar Pradesh is India's largest state. In 2000, Uttarakhand broke off to become its own state. And from a research design perspective, this becomes a great natural experiment to study and test whether norms persist over time. Now you have a new political system. So you moved out of a multi-party system that was in Uttar Pradesh. Now you have a two-party system, and there's a literature saying two-party systems are better able to provide public services because they can appeal to a larger section of kind of centrist voters versus those that are multi-party tend to be a bit more extreme or not converge across public goods. So the history of Uttar Pradesh is a starting point where this state was legalistic. So there's a colonial history to law and order being part of the state. And this perspective persisted over time. India's National Academy, where all the IAS officers are trained, was placed in Uttar Pradesh. And 15 out of 31 cabinet secretaries, this is the highest ranking civil servant in India, have come from Uttar Pradesh. This is just to point out how important this state has been to India's public administration and a key example of good governance from the perspective of leaders is this kind of legalistic state. In the 1990s, underprivileged castes mobilized in the state. So this is a picture of Mayawati, who's the first Dalit chief minister, coming from the same underprivileged caste as the women who I showed earlier were cooking the midday meal. So she came from that caste and rose up to power. I mean, it's quite a seismic change in the history of politics in the state, and fought through this thing that many refer to as dignity politics, saman ki rajniti, and that means that you're fighting for dignity and equal treatment of the least advantaged. She becomes the first Dalit chief minister, but very critically uses the law to support her constituents. So there's an act called the SC/ST Atrocities Act. These are atrocities committed against underprivileged castes and tribals, and she really pushed for enforcement of this act. She disciplined the police force, and interestingly, I did a lot of my field work in UP. My family's from there originally. And just observing how the police shifted under her management, I mean, quite remarkably became much more orderly and with a focus towards supporting disadvantaged groups. And the bureaucracy reinforced the importance of rules. When this party came in, a lot of bureaucrats were experiencing a churning of politics. There were a lot of transfers happening of officials, and they started using rules to protect their sphere of influence. So, one saw in UP this kind of inspection regime emerge in the education system, where schools would be observed for implementing the Right to Education Act. And in this case, I was looking at infrastructure targets, and these were very critical. But officials are often overriding community demands. So when community members came forward and made demands to officials, they were asked to submit to a formal grievance process. And that process is very lengthy, unreliable, uncertain. And those who are more empowered are better able at using the rules to kind of get what they need out of the state. And so in many ways, community voice weakened over time. Now, this is how legalism weakens the kind of initiative that officials may have. And so here's an official from Uttar Pradesh who said, the more I push to do something different, the more I'm viewed with suspicion. In his case, he was trying to develop a school for an informal settlement, a slum, in the district of Agra. And there, because the slum is not recognized, the government was not ready to open a school there, because then they would have recognized the settlement. And in a way, they would have legalized what was seen as illegal behavior of having an informal settlement. So he had tried his best. And the response was that my office might think I must be gaining something personally out of it, some faida, some benefit. And so this distrust and this suspicion undermines a bureaucratic initiative. And I raise this example just to point out, because you might think that it's just the case that in Himachal Pradesh you get good bureaucrats who are just benevolent, and elsewhere you just have bad bureaucrats. That's not the case. There are many examples of officials in a state like Uttar Pradesh or in Uttarakhand trying to bend rules to serve local populations, but norms come in the way, and this is a key indicator of how norms undermine individual initiative. And so in the book I kind of talk about how we distinguish the beliefs officials have from the norms they're subjected to. You could believe in something, but you may not be able to actually enact it. Okay, getting to Uttarakhand. So Uttarakhand breaks off. This is a view looking down at a school. Sorry, I'm looking down at a village. I'm standing at the school. And so where I'm standing, children have to walk to every day. So so you get a sense of the challenge. It's very similar in a way to what I observed in Himachal Pradesh. So there was this alienation in the state. So Pahadis are kind of hill people, or it's a way of describing the hill population that had become alienated from UP's administration. And the important thing to take away here is that when Uttarakhand was formed, they tried to copy the policies that were there in Himachal Pradesh. Why don't we bring women's groups in? And why don't we try to do similar things? So if you think about it, the kind of global development approach is to take best practices from here and let me cut and paste them. So officials actually tried to do that, yet they really failed. This is a women's association in district of Almora in Uttarakhand, a similar type of group to the group I showed you in Himachal Pradesh. They also emerged in the early 1980s, managing the forest, managing other collective resources. This you see them doing their kind of their starting dance. It's like a ceremonial dance that they do before any of their meetings. And they're dancing in front of this building here, which actually happens to be a primary school, but it's unrecognized. It's a school they built with their own resources, and it started as a daycare center and gradually became a primary school. They funded from the community the land for the school. They put in their labor to build the building, and they provided a teacher. And this just gets to an example of kind of self-provisioning. And in fact, this part of India was studied by Eleanor Ostrom and some of her collaborators as an example of kind of, you could say, this collective action that happens spontaneously. Sadly, this collective action can also decline, and that's what I observed in this state, that this group, which had a history of local collective action, began organizing and making demands on the state to recognize the school that they had built. They had even sought to support the government primary school. But after many failed attempts, I found in this village at the time of my fieldwork that many had exited, and they were seeking private schooling. This is what a mother says, who I interviewed. We went to the block, the administrative block, to complain about the lack of teachers, but nobody listens to what we say. We even had the village council head, this is the Gram Pradhan, an elected official, write letters. We received no response, and things have become hopeless. So now we're looking at private school. And this just points to how collective action is not just a matter of a community's propensity to work together through social capital. And I think that's the key of this element of the book, is to show that it's not just about the right social ingredients. Yes, it's great to have that social capital, but you need an agency to facilitate and enable that social capital to translate into accountability at the local level. And here, there was a real lack of such accountability. And here's an official from the state saying to me in an interview, there's no benefit to working with women's groups. They're nothing but political bases. And in Hindi, the stark term, you refer to them as Rajniti ke adde. I mean, they're just these blocks of politics that are interfering in the state's activities. And these officials thought they were doing the right thing. They're simply applying the rules that didn't allow extra teachers and extra resources that this women's association was demanding. All right. Just to wrap up, I know I've gone well over, but I might as well. What I've shared with you is two different worlds of legalism and a world of deliberation. But I want to interface that with another variable, which is socioeconomic inequality. And what I focused on is a region of India that has relatively low inequality. These are groups that till the soil, right? So whether you're an upper caste or lower caste, you might be involved in agriculture. Gender norms are relatively more equal in this part, so you'll see a lot of women's associations. So I see variation in the way policies are co-produced. More inclusively in Himachal Pradesh. In Uttarakhand, it encourages more substitution. Over time, I learned to exit and find collective substitutes from my group. In the other two states, I look at much higher levels of inequality. And there I find co-production in the legalistic setting is more episodic. Anytime that groups can come together, they do, but then they wait for the state to respond. And it becomes this waiting game that goes on for quite a while. However, when you try to encourage deliberation in a high inequality setting, and I have a case there where I look at a women's intervention for women's empowerment under the education program. And so there's a kind of effort to reform a bureaucracy, transition it from legalistic to more deliberative. I find that co-production is full of conflict. Their local officials have to work with underprivileged groups to kind of voice demands on the rest of the bureaucracy. They often have to sit and develop opportunities for them to speak in public spaces against the will of upper castes. So in some sense, co-production here is not a neat and tidy story. It's much more conflictual. So I think I can end there. I'll just say that this is, let's see, I shared with you bits of chapters 4 and 6 mainly, but I have a chapter where I look at norm change and I look beyond India. And so you can think about how this study really might push our thinking outside of South Asia. But maybe some concluding implications first. One is that the book gets us to think beyond formal institutions. And so a lot of the literature on state capacity in India, you can see these are the adjectives that the Indian state has acquired over decades of social science. And the emphasis has been that the Indian state can do some things, but not other things. And the focus has been on the lack of a strong Weberian state. So it's weak, strong, weak. And the emphasis is on formal bureaucratic structures, which I think are very important. But what's missing is that notwithstanding the same structures, informal norms can vary. And so the Indian state is not the same thing all over the place. It varies quite remarkably. Yeah, this is a lot on the slide, but how about I just point to the very top, that the theoretical framework really attempts to bring in a multi-level and relational approach to the state. And that connects your street-level bureaucrat to those higher up. There's a lot of literature on the frontline state, and there's a literature on the elites, but the transmission mechanism across levels of bureaucracy is often missing, and that's what you need to get local information and local ideas to percolate upwards. Yeah, a little bit about citizens, because I've said a lot about bureaucracy, but I think this really has implications for how we understand citizen experiences of the state. So there's a literature on policy feedback. For those who, I know all of you here are in a public policy setting, so you might be familiar with this, that policies shape politics and not necessarily the other way around. What I try to add to this literature is that it's not just about the design of policy, but the implementation of policy which shapes politics. That the way that the cop treats someone, the way the teacher interacts with parents, and the way that the frontline official interacts with communities has a massive effect on how citizens come to perceive the state and their ability to make claims on it. And so there's a literature here that's growing about how marginalized groups see the state, the administrative burdens they may experience when seeking services, but also what they see as the very practice of citizenship. Should I engage collectively to support the state, or should I exit from the state? So I think we can think about the long durée of development of state-society relations as well from this perspective. I have policy implications, but let's just stop here. I just want to thank you. This is the India edition, which is about 1/10 of the price of the Cambridge University Press edition. So for those of you in India, but the paperback is coming out later this year. So hopefully that encourages some of you to get it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Akshay. That was fantastic. First of all, before I go into my reflection and questions, I just wanted to acknowledge the folks in the room. So current MPAs, could you put your hands up? All of these guys have already been in 2 economics lectures today, so they're doing really well. And then we also have a lot of former MPAs in the room. So alumni, if you put your hands up. Yeah, so in the reception, you guys should chat to each other, because it's really nice to see your faces. And something else that should be familiar, particularly for the alumni, is some of the names, some of the theory, some of the readings, the authors that Akshay located his work in at the start. So keep your eye out in the syllabus. And actually, I've just been debating whether or not to put policy feedback in the syllabus, and so maybe it's going to get thrown back in. I think there's, just as an opening observation about this work, particularly for those of us who do research, I really like how you set up the overarching question and then the operationalized question, this use of subnational variation, the connection of the micro and the meso, and really doing that micro level work in a developing country. I think all of these are really notable aspects of this work, and I think we were all wowed by the depth of the research and its comprehensiveness. So really wonderful to see that recognized and to bring that here. I think the second thing that I wanted to say is this focus on norms is so important, and just really drilling, particularly for folks in this type of program who are really interested in policy making, that the idea that the policy on the page isn't what takes place necessarily on the ground. The policy making is the start, not the end. This connection, I think you use the term head connected to the hand throughout the book, which I really like. And this question of what fills that space. What's the balance of rules and norms in that? How these are created, enforced, reproduced, thought was really important. It reminded me a lot of sort of a classic business school line from Drucker, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. You know, I don't want to get into culture here, but sort of substituting norms eat strategy or norms eat policy for breakfast, I thought was a really, bumper sticker for some of the arguments you're making. I guess the sort of next comment I wanted to make was just around this interest or this focus on power relations and participation, which I think is so important. This focus on deliberation and connecting. You make an argument about policy feedback that it helps us reconsider direction, the direction of impact. So you talk about apathy amongst amongst citizens. And you say apathy is a product of being excluded from these processes, or a product of being pushed out by folks who are not interested in engaging, or for whom are using these rules to not connect. And so the sort of direction of causality with apathy, I think, is so important, particularly if we're looking at intervention discourse or development discourse, where, these people don't care, they're not engaged, all of that, and to really question that and push that back, I think, was extremely important. I also know you didn't get enough time to talk about that 2x2 table where you were looking at the legalistic and deliberative versus the higher and lower inequality settings. But I think for this audience in particular, connecting deliberation, bureaucratic norms in the state, and markets is really, really interesting. So the idea that in this situation where the state is not engaging with people, that there becomes a push towards privatization, towards provisioning, towards creating alternatives to the state, I think is really, really interesting. And we're really interested in these sort of state-market relations. And I just did a discussion with a really wonderful scholar from LSE, Sohini Carr, who was talking about microfinance. And she was saying, we really should pay attention to microfinance, because what people are really using for is consumption that's substituting the state. So where you see really high levels of microfinance, people paying for healthcare, paying for education. And it was such an interesting sort of reflection on these connection between privatization, financialization of things like microfinance, and then, of course, these deliberative patterns. So I thought that was really interesting, and again, particularly for our audience. So I had sort of a few questions. I'll maybe start with sort of the most technical one. So you set out this distinction between deliberative bureaucratic norms and legalistic bureaucratic norms. And I wanted you maybe just to expand a little bit on, what's the value of talking about these in terms of those terms or in terms of bureaucratic norms, rather than just saying, I compared a high discretion bureaucracy with a low discretion. Just if you could just flesh that out a little bit more.
Thanks. And thank you for these rich comments. And definitely thinking about how markets develop is I think, a critical one. Just before I get to your question, just on markets, I think in the comparative chapter 8 of the book, I look at the development of education in Kerala. I revisit the Kerala case, taking into account how state bureaucracy there functioned. And one of the key actors that's missing from our study of the Kerala model is the private sector. In fact, Kerala has the highest rate of privatization in schooling in all of India. And it began as religious schools. And that was early on in the period of state formation, where the bureaucracy learned to work with religious authorities, Hindu, Muslim, and Christian, and so granted them control over management, but it was publicly funded. So these are private aided schools, as they're referred to. And so that's an interesting separation of private management from public funding. So that's just to point out that markets may well play a role that I don't think we're studying closely enough. Yes, now to this question about just high versus low discretion and why deliberative, versus legalistic. Well, for one, I mean, having high discretion doesn't really tell you much about how to use that. So in some sense, what is the guiding light of that discretion? And their norms came into play. And you can have a bureaucracy that does grant high discretion, but it does so in a legalistic manner. So long as you're able to refer back to rules, you may select among which of the rules you want. So whether to pull someone over or not, right? That can be encoded. What cannot be encoded is for you to go above and beyond. And so there, I think norms really mattered. And another reason to say deliberative rather than high versus low discretion is that I think the emphasis on discretion, while important, tends to treat the bureaucrat as like a kind of asocial individual. Like, I just have discretion and I just use it. But surely I talked to my office mates about how I used my discretion, and surely their responses to how I'm using it will inform how I may or may not choose to use it next. And so there I'm trying to socialize discretion a little bit and take us out of this kind of atomistic model of individual bureaucrats just having discretion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's a really useful elaboration, sort of reinforcement of why this normative lens is so important. I have one really simple question before I open it up into the audience, which I like to ask anyone doing research is, you come in knowing this space, you start your research. What surprised you most in this work? What sort of caught you by surprise doing your analysis or doing the write-up? What sort of jumped out to you that you hadn't expected?
Well, I had gone in very much searching for social capital.
Interesting.
That was the overarching, you could say, hypothesis that there's just better organized communities in some regions of India for a number of historical reasons, and surely I'm going to find something to do with, say, the level of ethnic diversity, which is a key variable, or something to do with community level norms. I think that the role of bureaucracy was truly it was surprising and unexpected, and just the amount that bureaucrats were kind of articulating their work as if they were almost working in the private sector in Silicon Valley. I mean, I'm orchestrating relations between teachers and parents and my higher level officials. I'm trying to facilitate an environment. I mean, they're using these terms. I never thought that bureaucrats thought that way, particularly under-resourced ones on the front lines. So yeah, probably that.
That's so interesting. I'm happy to open it up to questions if I've got plenty more, but.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I think if there are any online. Okay, so maybe maybe we can give you the microphone, so you can voice some of those questions online. And those in the room, you can show me your hand if you're interested in having a.
Sure. So I'll just pop in my question very quickly. I think I read the book earlier this year for one of my assignments. It's super exciting to read this work. And I wanted to ask you about a bit of norms change, but I also see there's a full chapter which I didn't refer to. But I also want to get deeper into, like you chose the example of education, because that's where you can see the interaction with the bureaucrat on the street level. But especially in India, how do we see a state today in terms of public service delivery, where you have an Aadhaar, a digital ID, where you have a UPI, you have a direct benefit transfer which is happening to the individual. So where exactly is the overall trend of bureaucracy moving? Are we really moving from more deliberative to more legalistic bureaucracy? That's my question.
Yeah, maybe you can add a few from online as well.
Yeah.
And if there are anybody in the room, show me your hand.
And there's another question which is also coming from maybe just the context of India, which says that when we try to informalize the roots, especially the oral and unwritten, are in a sense banned by Supreme Court of India. It prohibits official to follow oral orders. So how we see functionality of this model in such situation? I think the person is referring to the deliberative bureaucracy again.
Awesome. Let me take one in the room as well. Then you can gather the thoughts.
Yeah.
You had a question.
Yes, thanks. Thank you so much. It's very exciting work. As we talked before about the sort of different kinds of bureaucracy or forms of organization, if you like, there is also sometimes, and you've found that, I think, across your states, a functionality about which bureaucracy or which form of bureaucracy actually prevails. If you take it in terms of like the police, you mentioned the police or mentioned schooling, they're completely different activities that require a different kind of organization. And you have this also, for instance, very strongly in health. You tend to very much build deliberative bureaucracies in public health, but not so much in healthcare delivery. So I think, I'm sure you bring this out in the book, but those kind of distinctions are often something that doesn't necessarily emerge from the research, but is a conceptual, in your theoretical kind of beginnings, consideration, which I'm sure you bring out.
Thank you so much. So it's 3 questions?
Yeah, I'll try to do them all justice. So the book focuses on education, and I do think about the scope conditions of that argument, right? So certainly education being a policy domain that has a range of tasks of varying levels of complexity, you cannot just translate that to every other task. But I do think that there are other policy domains which could be relevant from, say, health to, anti-poverty programs to housing, really where you need public input and where you need interagency coordination to get things done. So I think that opens up to a whole range of kind of state, kind of social programs and so on. You asked about the Indian state today, and I think there's a shift really to cut out the bureaucrat. So the notion of a direct benefit is that if the benefit is coming through someone else, there's going to be leakage. That's the term that's frequently used. There's leakage in the system. Then things like Aadhaar is, for those who aren't familiar, it's a universal ID through which one can access state services of various kinds. And these are efforts, I think, to make the access to services easier for the citizen, so you don't have to go through hoops. I think the challenge is that might enable one to get access to resources, but it'll be difficult to get quality public services just by using those techniques, because I think those technologies are, in a way, attempts to simplify things, which could be good. You can provide information, but it's I struggle to understand how providing a direct benefit or providing someone an ID card will necessarily translate into providing better education or better or better health. And I think in terms of what this suggests for where the Indian state is going, I think the investment is not going towards the more difficult tasks. And I think that's a problem, because you can gain a lot of political points by doing the things that are lower, you could say, that are lower complexity and that you can claim credit for. It's easier for me as a leader to claim credit that I got you all this this ID card and so on. But it's harder to say I got your school working, because there's so many actors involved, right? So I think this shows you, I think quite intelligently, political leadership pivoting. Okay, let me claim credit for these things. The Indian context, I didn't fully get the question. I think the question had to do with the Supreme Court not encouraging informalization of rules. Is that what the question was? Yes. Oh, right. Okay. Yes. Local and unofficial, and and often the next word is corrupt. And so I think that's a fair concern. If I were to, have written this book from the perspective of, say, I don't know, pick your favorite neoclassical economist, I probably would have said that all of these social groups are seeking patronage. So the women's associations were seeking employment, so they got this ballooning employment register in Himachal Pradesh. Now the state has a public deficit, right? On the flip side, you got monitoring at the local level. And so at some level, one needs to think about informalization to what end and at what cost, and to whose benefit and to whose loss. And I think a more nuanced conversation about informality and informalization is needed. I mean, after all, isn't microcredit all about using informal norms for the sake of integration into a financial system? Though it is an important question, because you can ask, is there a point at which informality does just lead to all the perverse things that become associated with not having enough following of rules? The question about functionality, right, and which type of bureaucracy prevails. That's a great question. It gets back to the scope conditions of the argument and how to extend it. I've tried to focus less on sector and more on task. And I thought task could be a way, because I'm working on police reform as we speak in India right now, and a lot of the work I'm doing is around improving women's security in India, a very complex task, which kind of requires a blend of commitment to rules. For example, India has a Domestic Violence Act, but then how do you incorporate the perspectives of women, particularly those who are seeking justice, into the process of implementation? And there, I think, perhaps there's a need for more of a hybrid that is responsive to rules, but as responsive to the public. And the police is perhaps at that point where you see models emerging of community policing, which is about following the rules, but with community buy-in, input, and support. And so it might require, and what we're finding with our research on police is that it's actually, that's where they become the most uncomfortable, when they have to start working with communities. If you tell them rules, if they focus on rules, that works a lot better. And that's actually very important, so getting cases registered. But then how do you ensure that you conduct an investigation appropriately? How do you ensure you provide proper medical treatment to those who need it? There, this kind of, local level deliberation seems to matter as well, and I think it's task-oriented, possibly more than just sectoral, but I'm open to being persuaded that some sectors may be.
What I meant by this is every sector obviously has an operationalization of what it is, its function is. And that then defines the tasks that need to be done. And that then, in a sense, informs which kind of organizational structure is required. So you have to kind of do this whole kind of iterative process through a sort of functional operational kind of analysis.
Awesome. Yeah, here's a question.
Hi, Dr. Akshay. I really enjoyed the presentation. There's two questions. India being in the philanthropy sector in India, education is being one of the biggest one that take the chunks of the philanthropy money. And in your work, I used to work. I'm working within the space of social entrepreneurship, and during my work in India and Bangladesh, I saw that there is a huge, first of all, there is a huge presence of social entrepreneurs in education, Pratham, Saransh, Leadership of Equity, and all these people. And when I was working with them, I saw that they were really like working to change the norms of parents, teachers, state, and all those things. So I see that there hasn't been much inclusion of social entrepreneurship in the way they are changing work. Was that a deliberate, say, not I'm going to include them in my study? So that's one. And the second one is just a kind of conversation or like a expansion of the argument from you on policies shape politics and not otherwise. And I want to challenge that bit because if state policies can change politics, then I'm also sitting with the case of Delhi, how Arvind Kejriwal really pushed and changed the public education there. Do you think that was effective or not? So that kind of sits in contradiction to your argument. So, yeah, those
Sure. Thanks for that. Should we take more? Or?
Yeah, if there are more, there are two online. Are there any takers in the room? If not, we can definitely. Yeah, let's go Jacopo first, and then.
Sure. Thanks a million. PhD student here. I'm pretty inspired by the incredible research, design, and delivery. It's really, really, really inspiring for me. A question related indeed to policy implications. You said that the unsuccessful state tried to mimic some of the institutional features of the successful state, and this didn't prove right. And so were you a policymaker in the position, in a way, to enact a similar reform? In the light that, of course, it's something as nuanced as enabling a degree of flexibility, because it's ultimately about customizing service delivery to specific contextual conditions, but at the same time nuanced enough to be distinctive, like it's indeed an ideal type, as you frame it. What is the kernel of it? And this leads me to a second sub-question, which is still about this topic. Some of the features that you presented about the successful case, so again, the deliberative mode of bureaucracy, really resemble the way Finnish education works. Which is, of course, I don't want to draw an implausible parallel here, because, of course, the contextual condition.
You stepped into his trap.
Okay, great. But again, it doubles down indeed on the context of what are the broader implications for bureaucratic development in customized welfare state provision in the 21st century. It's in a way a deepening of what a Weberian bureaucracy means in this respect. If we want to travel as far as this comparison, how unlikely it is may suggest.
Let's take some online questions.
There are 3 questions. So do you want to take these first and then I?
Let's do these first.
Okay.
Yeah, because these are getting
Okay.
quite deep. Yeah, let's go.
If it's all right, I'll go in reverse order.
Yes.
Okay, so this question on Finland, it turns out to be one of my cases in the comparative chapter. So I extend the argument and revisit more kind of well-known terrain. I look at Kerala, I look at China, I look at a comparative case between France and Finland. And in a way, France and Finland act as the two poles of this world of legalism and deliberation in a high resource environment, right? So France has a history of a centralized state going back to Napoleon, perhaps earlier, and there's work on administrative traditions by Guy Peters and others who are writing about the French state and trying to kind of clamp down on differences and not giving autonomy to local level. Finland, as you point out, is the other end of the spectrum. It's very much about giving local autonomy and then having almost multidisciplinary teams, right, of social workers, teachers, parents, and health workers combine their efforts to customize education. And that French and Finland comparison begins from the observation that if you look at the PISA tables, so this are the education outcomes that are collected by the OECD, France pretty much shows the highest level of inequality in outcomes between different social groups and between geographies, and Finland is the reverse, a high performer and very low spread between those in the bottom quintile and the top. So that's like a very important transition that Finland has made. I mean, a couple of observations about that. One is that I'm glad it resonated with you. I think part of what I wanted to show is that, in fact, this is not unique to Himachal Pradesh. There's something about having a deliberative state that can encourage quality, local level adaptation. You call it customization, and I think that's true for Finland, because 40% of kids are in remedial education, which is incredible when you think about it. It means almost half your kids are getting a very customized education. I think probably higher level of resources enables that degree of customization, but the bottom line in terms of what's motivating and sustaining such a model, I think has to do with deliberation. So I think I would invite a conversation between those who study advanced economy, bureaucracies, and in countries like India, because I think we'll find similarities and differences like this. Now, about the policy implication, right? Cutting and pasting, and here, let me just go to my policy slide. I mean, the first thing I'll say is that, there's a reason why a lot of places in India and perhaps elsewhere stick to legalism. It gets you a lot of things. You can build schools, you can do the things that you can claim credit for as a politician, the very visible policies. I've constructed a school, I've ensured that it has a midday meal, but you can't get out of that the more challenging, complex tasks for which you might not be able to claim credit. And the challenge is that once you invest in legalism, you can develop a culture that becomes so compliance-oriented that you're not able to shift to unleash any local level, for lack of a better word, innovation. I think this is really about innovating at the local level. Now, how do you get there? One is I think you have to work incrementally. And I think when Uttarakhand took policies from Himachal Pradesh, it was literally trying to cut and paste and scale them up without getting local level buy-in. And I think incrementalism is important because there's going to be backlash. When we theorize this from the perspective of norms, this becomes much clearer to us. If we just think about it, there's a set of practices, and I just take best practice from country A to country B, the cut and paste model. I think it ignores the politics, because you actually have to get buy-in, political buy-in, often from those who might feel that their jobs are on the line, or they may feel that their way of working is under challenge. So working incrementally, and encouraging some exemplars. And I think here I would be open to thinking about ways of, what are the entry points for any institutional change? Perhaps some entrepreneurial bureaucrats who are willing to take a risk, supporting them and enabling them. And I think it also requires a longer time horizon. So again, Uttarakhand tried to do it in 5 years, got a huge backlash, and it declined. And I see this story repeating itself. In fact, as one state official had said to me in an interview, India is a graveyard of pilots. So there's all these local level things happening, and they try to expand them really big, and then they fizzle out. So that's on the policy side. Getting to your two questions. The first one was about, challenging this policy shapes politics. So to say that policy shapes politics is not to say that the reverse is could not be true. In fact, I think that's the standard kind of political economy model, is that you have a set of interests, you aggregate them, they express their voice, and the state's policy is a result of that. What I'm trying to suggest is that we can look at downstream politics coming out of policy. So something like a political leader like an Arvind Kejriwal, very important. I look at the state of Bihar in my chapter 6, is it? On norm change. No, chapter 7, sorry, on norm change. There you get Nitish Kumar, a leader who really pushed education governance. And politics is really, really important to create an environment for bureaucratic change. I think these windows of opportunity come out because of politics. But then the question is, are you able to actually seize the opportunities? And there I think the bureaucracy and its behavior comes in. Philanthropy. So yeah, I didn't look at that kind of the growth of philanthropy in India. I think it's really important. I looked at probably smaller scale, informal. So I looked at women's associations, but I did do some field research with Pratham in UP, and I think these organizations play a critical role. What I found is that there was some effort to engage, even in a legalistic state, but only at the elite level. It didn't percolate down to the local level, and a lot of it was elite entry of these of best practices. Again, so Poverty Action Lab at MIT worked with Pratham, identified this thing called teaching at the right level. I'm working on this right now with some of them. How do you scale this up? And it's amazing. They just go to the top and say, we got all the ministers aligned, but how about the teacher? And often that's where the failure, that failure rested. So I think philanthropy has a big role to play. I still think bureaucracy needs to translate philanthropic expertise, input into kind of local buy-in from the frontline workers. So I think in future work, one can think about what is the role that a philanthropist can play in kind of working within a system rather than, okay, I'm going to change all the norms, because it's very difficult. You have to think about the time horizon. For most philanthropic projects, like 5 years, norm change can take 15 or 20 years possibly, right? So because of that, where exactly will non-governmental actors like that come in? And I think they would have to be a little bit more careful about precisely where they might be able to influence norm change. One thing I'm seeing is that many of them are trying to work more at the local level rather than just at the state level, because they're able to identify concrete models that they can then take back up to the state level and suggest ways of trying to scale these up. But it's I think, experimentation, all the way through.
Great. So before we go and have 2 more questions online, I think to finish up, I think just a quick comment on yours and Jacopo's discussion of Finland and advanced bureaucracies, as it were. I think indeed you can map on the deliberative bureaucracy onto the sort of neo-Weberian kind of ideas, where it's exactly the citizen focus and more like a co-creation agenda and all that. But that's just like as a side comment.
Fair enough.
I think the other 2 questions are also from the PhD students at IIPP. The first question they're asking is, in terms of opportunities for deliberation, learning, and adaptation, instead of a legalistic approach, do you see a role for the literature on dynamic capabilities applied and adjusted to public sector? And the second question is from Nadia, who is asking, can you shed light on the strategies employed to ease tension between political and elite bureaucracies to improve policy implementation outcomes? And I think a similar question for within the federal structure, the vertical communication channels between the national and the state government. And I think also there's a comment about the way you have sized the bureaucracy in India. You are saying it's 5,000 versus China is 500,000. But if you include street-level bureaucrats also in India, that number is in millions. So how are you scoping it?
Okay.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. So just on the last one, I was only referring to the IAS and thereafter the millions of street-level bureaucrats. So perhaps that point didn't get through, that this was just to look at the differences between China and India in terms of elite bureaucrats. Certainly there's way more in terms of street-level bureaucrats. I don't think I can do justice to all of these questions. So there's a question about easing tension between elite and local level. And I think perhaps a related question, how does national government connect with state governments? And here I think, one is finding, right now India is at a moment where federalism is actually in question, because a lot of policies are being announced by the central government with the expectation that states are simply going to comply. And so this notion of state autonomy is in some sense is openly being challenged. And I think there's a risk to that. In particular, policies like health, policing, education, those that require street-level bureaucrats, they're the remit by the Constitution of India as state-level policies. So in that sense, the central government can come up with guidelines, can come up with support, and there may even be policies, but it cannot just impose them. And so you will need state buy-in. And there, I think, there is an opportunity to encourage deliberation at the elite level. And that's probably where one can find ways that, in a similar way, it's at a very different scale, but one thing about the Finnish model is that there's very active role of central agencies in creating the platform for deliberation of local units. And one role that the Indian government can play is less so of a prescriber and more so of a kind of enabler. So creating a space for lessons to emerge, for transfer of knowledge between states, right? And of giving recognition to states as well, because a lot of these bureaucrats, I mean, I speak a lot about them, but they're really unsung heroes in many cases, teachers who went beyond, you know, the last mile to deliver education. So I think the more that the central government can provide such a platform, perhaps you can get compliance without having to prescribe it. So I'll just end with that thought. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and wonderful discussion. And I think we all really appreciate how the bureaucracy is eventually a normative construct, and we need to have a much better understanding, particularly on the street level bureaucracies. And of course, so thank you very much who joined us online, and thank you everybody who joined us in this incredibly hot room. So I don't know, outside is also really warm. I don't know why we have the heating is on as if we were in Finland. So maybe there is some bad policy learning going on here. But anyway, thank you so much, Akshay. Thank you so much, Kate, for the wonderful discussion. And so there is drinks outside, and stick around. I hope you can stick around as well, so people can ask questions or autograph. Hopefully have bought the book. And if you don't or haven't yet, then buy it soon. Thank you so much.